You want to kind of take it away there, Khrys? Get started on this.
Yeah. So if you could just really quick put the video up to the top of this so it's not in the way of anything that's on the side as we come along, please. So a few things that, yeah, talking to you, Susan. You know how the video's on the side right now? It's going to get into some of the text, I think, maybe. So these are the things that we're going to be talking about today. So the role of fermentation, the science of distillation, the flavors of distillation, proofing of distillates, and different distillation styles. So the role of fermentation, we're going to be using water, sugar, and yeast to be able to create a musto muerto, tepache, shishi, kamun, which are all different words for the same type of dead must that's ready for distillation, and we're going to achieve an alcohol content of anywhere from like 4 to 9%. With most distillers of agave distillates, the distillers from around the world may go as high as 12 to 15%. The higher the ABV of the ferment, the higher ABV of the distillate. So let this fine gentleman, Eduardo Sanchez, talk a little bit about it.
Well, you know, this is for us, it's better, it's a nice tradition to use wood containers. And very clean process. No bacteria. And you mash agave and you mix it with the spring water. See, at the moment you use the spring water, in that moment you control your sugar content. It's very important to start your fermentation with the same sugar content always. Because same sugar means same alcohol. See? So next to do is to try to get the same flavor always. And you have no choice, you have to control your temperature in your fermentation. If you start with 25 degrees Celsius, you have to finish with 25 degrees Celsius in 5 days. See? If you have no consistent, you never get the same flavor. See? So clean process and a nice consistency is a good quality, is a good quality control.
So once you've achieved your fermentation is complete, you're going to go to distillation, and essentially we have what we're using is we're heating the mosto so that we can separate the alcohol from the water, and we essentially have two different types of distillation. There's going to be simple, which is otherwise known as pot distillation, and fractional, which we would know as column distillation. So simple, aka pot distillation, we're going to slowly bring the fermented liquid to a boil of 100 degrees Celsius, 212 Fahrenheit, in order for the alcohols to turn into a vapor as those fumes rise and hit a cooling point, resulting in condensation, where the gas vapors are converted back into a liquid solution with a higher alcohol content. With column distillation, basically the same type of thing, but the alcohols with the higher boiling points condense on each plate, while those with lower boiling points will pass through, and the process repeats as per plates which are used. While the musto is heated to a boiling point, a distiller will also measure the temperature of the steam. Depending on the producer, and if it is the first or second distillation, this ranges anywhere from 60 degrees Celsius to 95 degrees Celsius. And within that context, you're going to get different flavor profiles and different parts of the alcohols through different temperatures of the heating process. So this is just a quick animated video that explains the process of distillation. If you notice, we're going to have a flame on the bottom, and this is going to heat up the mosto. You see the vapors are going to rise. They're going to condense down through this tube right here. You've got cold water coming from the bottom, the hot water expels on the top, and then through that you have from the condensation, you have the vapors, the alcohol vapors that have turned back into liquid form. So that, right in a nutshell, is the basic elements of distillation. And pass it over to Ryan.
All right. So usually when you're distilling mezcal, traditional mezcal, most people are doing two distillations. So they'll take the mash or the mosto, which is the fermented agave, and water that's already, they've decided, using usually their just aroma and taste, they've decided that it's ready to distill. So they'll load that in the still, and say you're using a 300 liter still, maybe you'll fill it with 200 liters, 250 liters of mosto, and you'll distill that. And that first distillation, you're going to get something around 20 to 30%. And they call that ordinario, común, or chiche. So once they've done that and the whole teen has been distilled once, then they'll do a second pass through the still. And they'll fill the still usually almost all the way on the second run. It's just liquid now. There's no agave fiber in it. That's one important thing that we should mention. With traditional mezcal, almost always you're distilling the actual fiber, the cooked agave, in the still along with the juices. Whereas with tequila and a lot of other, I think almost all other distillates, it's just a liquid being distilled. So anyways, on the second run through the still, they'll fill that with the ordinario, and they'll distill it again. And that will result in something around, between 45, 65% alcohol. And yeah, when it's all said and done, you'll get somewhere around 7 to 10%. I was telling Khrys that I think it's a little higher, but generally around there.
And if you want to talk about the compounds in.
Okay, so the mash or the mosto, it has water, mostly water, and then it has a lot of other things going on in there. So there's ethanol, and then there's all these different superior alcohols and different chemicals. In the distillation, you're really trying to basically separate out the ethanol, but with a pot still, it's not a really efficient or a really exact type of distillation. So you are getting a lot more of these other things, which we call congeners. Anything besides ethanol and water is a congener. And with mezcal, especially, you get a lot of these other chemicals. I'm not getting a lot of them in a quantity that'd be harmful to you, but you're getting enough of them where there's just a lot more flavor. There's a lot more going on in there than usually would be. And here we have a little chart showing some of the flavors that are derived from different chemicals that you can find in a distillate. So you can see here on the side that says familia, families, there's esters, acids, aldehydes. I'm not sure what furanos would translate to, terpenes, phenols, acetate. So you can see something for me that I often find in certain mezcals is like a banana flavor. So that would be coming from these esters, the putinate. I don't know how that would translate. And then, different acids, you get these different flavors like Swiss cheese, sweat, it says vanilla, arnica, goat is one of them from this hexonic acid. Wood flavors. Some of this green apple is coming from aldehydes. Also, these wood notes and tobacco notes might be coming from the furfurol. So you can tell there's different these different flavors and aromas that you find in mezcal. There is a correlation, a chemical correlation to the different congeners that are in there.
And that's the deliciousness of what we're looking for.
Yeah. So we got to talk a little bit about methanol. You know, pure methanol is very toxic, and especially if you consume it pure, it's very toxic. But usually in small doses, like when it is being consumed with ethanol, it's not really toxic for you. So there is often, I mean, some methanol. We go to the next slide. All right, maybe later on we'll see a slide that shows what the CRM tests for, and you can see the percentage of methanol.
I can scoot to that.
We can.
Okay. Go ahead.
So yeah, so when they're distilling on the second pass through the still, kind of break it down into these 4 categories. The first couple ounces or few ounces that come out of the still, the first drops are what you'd call the 4 shots. There's not too much ethanol in there. That's more of the super volatile chemicals, and that's usually discarded. So they're discarded usually anywhere from an ounce to maybe half a liter. Sometimes that part is actually discolored. If the still hasn't been cleaned properly, it'll come out kind of greenish or milky. There's some pretty nasty stuff in those first drops that come out of the still. And then next you have the heads or the puntas. So you're going to start around 80% ethanol and just start working its way down. And then they make cuts when they're distilling, because they want to end up at the end. You want to have these different sections of the distillate, and you mix them together depending on flavors and aromas. So they'll make a cut at around 60% or 60% alcohol that's coming off the still, and then that part from around 60 to 40% is like the body or the corazón, the cuerpo. And then around 40%, they'll make another cut, and anything that's below that is the tails. And they'll probably stop distilling maybe when there's only about like 15% alcohol coming off the still. And that homogenized tails will be around like 30% alcohol usually.
Yeah, and when I was speaking with Felipe Camarena, he was saying that within about 15% ABV on the tails, the methanol level spikes and goes through the roof. So that's where most of the methanols are going to be within that aspect of it.
Which is something that's unique to agave distillates. So like science, because methanol has a much lower boiling point, like science would say that it should be the very first thing to come off. But for some reason in agave distillates, there's different spikes throughout the distillation, and they don't know why 100%. From what I've been able to gather, there's a lot of different theories as why that might be. Yeah.
It's a very interesting product to distill with, for sure. Then different cuts within that. So within the heads, puntas, flora, cabeza, those are all different colloquial terms. We have our acetones, or methanol, ethyl acetate, and ethanol that's going to be within that. Then the body, the corazon, is going to be ethanol. It's going to be most of your alcohol content. And then in the tails, the colas, we have ethanol, methanol, propanol, and water. And by combining certain elements of each of those, we end up with all the flavors of what we're looking for. Because if we were doing just a calm distillation, we're just looking for ethanol, that's it. But all these other things add flavor and character to the distillate as well.
And I think a little side note, like the CRM, probably the CRT, like the Consejo, those are like the regulatory bodies for mezcal and tequila. They kind of recommend that they come and tell you how they want you to make their mezcal, so it will most easily pass their analysis. They really just want you to use the body almost. But if you try some of the pure body, it often doesn't have nearly as much aroma as the heads.
Yes, puntas, which is very much the hip thing these days. It's what all the crazy kids are drinking these days.
Someone asked, are the heads and tails reused in small batch mezcal distillation? Definitely. A lot of people will save the tails and throw them back in to the next distillation. Or you were saying, Khrys, even into the fermentation in tequila, no?
Yeah. And some producers are doing that. And I think that's done as a way to, obviously not lose any product, but also so you have a little bit more of a consistency that's going from one production batch to the next. And even though, as you had mentioned before, it may have come from a different variety of agave that they're putting in there. It's just having that same consistency over and over again. For sure.
Someone also asked, is anyone importing puntas? I think I didn't, what's the...
La Venenosa.
Yeah, La Venenosa, I think.
Yeah, but I don't think the ABV on the La Venenosa for the United States was the same as it was for Mexico. I could be completely wrong on that. But I do believe, and that might be one, and it was definitely above 55. And I know that within the world of tequila, mezcal, and raicilla, the normas for those products do not allow for anything to be bottled above 55% alcohol.
Brian Rossi was saying that the La Venenosa is 63, but then also the question of how is the quantity of methanol controlled in the puntas?
Can we flip forward to that slide with the CRM? We still not. Yeah, this one. Okay, so this is the specifications for different chemicals in the mezcal for it to pass analysis, chemical analysis. And here you have the maximum for methanol is 300 milligrams per 100 milliliters of ethanol. And so these numbers are kind of arbitrary. They don't really have too much to do with, like, at this level, it won't hurt you. The methanol won't hurt you. To give an example, like for schnapps in Europe, I believe or in Germany, they allow 1,000 milligrams of methanol per 100 milliliters.
Yeah.
So then usually, I think the question was more specific to with the methanol of the puntas coming off, like, is there concern about how high the methanol content might be in the puntas? And I guess really that's to say, if it doesn't pass through the CRM, then they're not going to be selling those puntas out into the market.
Yeah, I don't know. I've sent some puntas into a lab for analysis, and along with other cuts, and they actually came back with less methanol, like a 65% alcohol puntas had considerably less methanol than a 50% mezcal. I think that has something to do with what we were talking about earlier, with the methanol being found in the tails of the agave distillates.
Yep.
Yeah.
And which the point being made too, that of course it could still be sold into the market if it goes above the methanol, kind of parameters, just obviously not as a mezcal, but as a destilado or agave spirit.
Correct.
So, and then the question, if we want to go back a little bit, that came up again, was about people putting spent liquid from the second distillation back into the fermenter, much like with sour mash process in whiskey.
Yep.
People are
on the second distillation,
so the spent liquid, not
like the vinazas, like what's left in the still.
Oh no! That Vinassus is going to get tossed.
Yeah, I've never heard of.
Yeah.
Is that what they're
Yeah.
referring to?
I'm not sure if Eric's referring to, let's see,
He says
yes.
yes.
Yep, he was. Yep.
I've never heard of anyone putting the vinazos back in to the
Yeah,
standard
because
distillation.
if I go back over here, this is where what's left in Vinasis is going to be all
Hey, man.
of this. These parts of the distillate are what's left. So everything that's going to be under that 100 degrees Celsius boiling point for water, the butanols, and below that, that's what's going to be left in the Vinasis because that was never able
No,
to.
I think those will be the first. Oh, you mean the ones that are above 100, like.
Right. Yeah. Did I say below? I meant, yeah, I was looking below. Sorry. Yeah, so everything that's above 100 is what's going to be retained within the Vinasis, and those are, the ones that are doing obvious damage within the fields and streams of which they have been dumped.
And then two other questions. One is if too much tail is added, is that what gives off the burnt rubber smell and taste?
I don't think so. I think
No.
that the burnt rubber smell and taste can come from when they're distilling just too hot and on the first distillation, and some of the agave fibers are actually being burnt in the still.
There's that too, but also in that context, producers who are heating the stills and don't have proper ventilation for the smoke, and the smoke ends up back in the still. I think that's a big influence within that, also in the context of how the agave is being cooked. I think those are the two main factors as to why something is going to be overtly smoked / burnt.
Uh-huh.
But that's, and everybody's going to have a difference of opinion within that context too. So that's from my personal experience. I also see, certain mezcals from certain towns as being more in that direction. As a style more than anything else.
And then the question too of do any mescaleros remove the heads from first distillation and not distill them a second time, instead using them for blending in a final product?
Yeah, so like commonly in Miahuatlan, really the traditional way of proofing down mezcal is using the first distillation, so stuff they would call shishe. Or they'll save, like you said, maybe not the heads, but something that's around like 40% alcohol from the first distillation and use it to proof the final product.
Okay.
Cool. So, and since we're talking about proofing down, so this is a little video of Emilio Valera from Mezcal de Mateo, kind of explaining how, and showing how he will proof based upon the product that is available to him, the different alcohol contents of each one, and how it's much more of an art form than a scientific cut and paste, boom, boom, boom type of thing.
Ahí lo vas probando como lo vas. Pues ya aquí toda la grabación está muy alta. Está en unos 60 grados a lo mejor, más o menos.
Right now the alcohol content is about 60%.
Entonces ya cuando llegue a 55 vamos a...
And so by taking a little bit from that other batch right there, then he's going to be able to bring down the ABV of the distillate. So if you see how the perlas are sticking around much longer than they were before, and they're not quite as large.
Entonces, estos garrafones, bueno, ¿qué diferentes?
Haz de cuenta que aquí empezamos en una graduación como de cercana a los 70 grados
70% alcohol?
y acá vamos a andar terminando como en 30, 25 grados.
Okay, so it's 35%. 25, 35 is like here? Good, you get that's so it gets the alcohol. So it's, I was like the very beginning.
¿Está toda?
140 proof.
¿Ya llegamos tanto?
So you blend them to get the direct.
How do you know?
By the bubbles.
So also, like, traditionally throughout Mexico, people often look for the cordón cerrado, or where the bubbles will kind of form all the way over the surface of the mezcal and stay there for a while. And that's usually when it's around 50%.
Yeah. And you'll notice how, like, each time that he adds a little bit more, those perlas are lasting longer within that context, right?
So, right. And so specifically in regard to that, the question being larger perlas that last longer are associated with a higher ABV, right?
A larger perla, like, so a mezcal that's like how he started it off in this video. He said it started around like 60. So it's a very big perla, but it goes away really fast.
Really fast, yeah.
And then it'll kind
So-
of get,
But the longer they remain is the indicator of the higher. Oh, wait, sorry. No, I see what you're saying. Never mind.
yeah. And then when it gets to around like 50%, the perlas will be slightly smaller, but they'll last a lot longer. And then when you get down to below like 45%, they'll be quite small and they won't last very long at all.
But I do have to say, even like it depends. So like within the world of tequila, Fortaleza Blanco at 40% has some nice pearls that are just a few that last at when you do a pour, and it's definitely different from other tequilas of the same ABV. So I don't necessarily know if it's always going to be like, 45 to 55, but the smaller or the lower the ABV, starting at around like 45, you will have a smaller perla compared to at 55% for sure. And but let's say, like, if you notice, the other thing that's talking about how long they last is in the context of how much water has been added. So you might have a distillate that's at 45% alcohol, but if there's been water added, the perlas will not hold as long.
And also some agave just inherently makes more like foam, more perlas. So like a Tepextate or a Jabalí at 50% alcohol is going to make a lot more, or in my experience at least, is going to make more perlado than an Espadín.
And so then there's, the question of if there is an actual measurement device to understand the proof, or beyond just seeing the perlas and judging that way. And I'm blanking on the name of the measurement tool that pretty much every Palenque has. What is it? The
Hydrometer.
hydrometer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Most people, traditionally in Mexico, it really is just a visual and then based on aroma and sight.
And would you say that that's pretty easily learnable, or does it come with a great deal of experience?
I think you can get pretty good, but I've been pretty surprised by how exact people like producers are when they.
Yeah, no, those guys get like really exact. Like for me, like if I'm within like 1 or 2 degrees, I'm like really happy.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, those guys are like on it, for sure. But, you know, of course, this is the more traditional way, and I'm sure I can guarantee you that, you know, when everything is said and done, you know, that they're going to start, you know, that they're using hydrometers and they are, you know, being more precise about what is going to be bottled.
Got it.
For sure.
All right.
You know, and, you know, regardless, that might include, you know, adding water if they don't have anything that is available to them, because not every producer is going to be bottling on site, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, or every brand, I should say, too. And within that context, oh wait, I skipped one. Oh, okay. So if I back up, so or scoot forward, the proofing for larger volume production is, you know, a larger producer is going to take a bunch of production runs, blend them together, and then they're going to simply use distilled water to bring it down to a specific alcohol content. You know, they're not going to get into like the balance of different types of cuts or whatever. And it just is really boom, like that. You know,
So are they even making cuts? They're not, right?
no, they're making cuts, but they're, you know, the heads and tails are going to be used at in some other aspect, but they're not going to be blended back in.
Okay.
And within the world of tequila, and I could be completely wrong on this, but I do not believe that anything other than water can be used for dilution.
And specifically, question, why distilled water?
Because it's taken all of the character. Well, there's, you know, it's just, so there's nothing that's going to, in distilled water, there's not going to be any aspect that is going to impart character to the distillate. So then if we talk about the difference in distillation time from one agave to another. So Emilio had told me who uses 400 liter stills. A single pass for the second distillation of Iniquines, which he would refer to as Alto, is 20 hours, Cupratas 24, and Tecliliana is 30. And because of the fact that each one of these agaves have a different sugar content and different water content, we can conclude that the agaves with a higher water content take less time to distill, even though the brick level of fermentation is going to be the same. And I think that if we look down here on the Espadín on Tepestate, absolutely the same type of thing here, right? So, you know, Espadín first distillation time is 4 hours, Tepestate is going to be 2. The yield difference starting off with the same amount of alcohol, right?
Same amount of, or the same volume of mash.
Yeah, yep. And then the second distillation for Espadín is going to be 10 to 12 hours versus Tepestate 4 to 5.
Yeah. And that's just because there's really just less sugar and there's less alcohol in the mash or in the mosto. So it's just when they're distilling, that whole process of the cuts is just going much faster. So maybe there's only, you know, on the first run, maybe there's only, for the second run, maybe there's only, you know, 5 liters of puntas instead of 10 or something like that.
Yeah, but getting back to what we were talking about earlier in the context of how much product is netted towards the end. So with your Espadín, with a 1,000-liter fermentation tank, half of that is going to be fiber, right? So you're only really going to, actually, wait, no. Is that right? No, never mind. Scratch that, I thought.
Okay, but question then is, can we attribute different potential methanol levels to agave species? Has anyone noticed if there's variation among that?
Yes, there's definitely variation. It seems like agave that's more fibrous, kind of, has more methanol,
So like Karwinski's.
and Tepextates. Yeah, there's definitely some correlation.
Yeah.
And that has more to do with just the five. That's what you're saying.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
And that has more to do with the fiber.
Yeah, that's what I've been told. I'm not sure if that's 100% true, but I do know that it definitely varies from species to species.
Yeah, and I have definitely heard the exact same thing too.
And does it have to do with the lower starch sugar mezcal yield that might impact the methanol? So as being said, there's the more mezcal, there's more liquid to dilute the methanol, whereas in some of the runs you definitely get lesser amounts from it, and so therefore a more concentrated methanol level, if I'm understanding that question correctly.
Kind of, yeah. I've also heard it related to in the context of most pure methanol is produced from trees, right?
Wood.
Yep, from wood, right? And what is going to be the most woody of all agaves? Karwinski, right? So, and that kind of makes the most sense. I mean, even when you taste the Karwinski cooked, it's still pretty dry. It's not quite as sugary. It's not quite as sweet to eat compared to the other types of agave.
Yeah, I think what I've heard is like the Tepextate has a lot of methanol, and all. So you might factor in that it just has a lot. It doesn't have very much sugar, so the amount of it that you have to put in to get the same amount as you might from a because Karwinski's can also be pretty sweet. So something that doesn't have very much sugar and is a little more fibrous, I think you're going to get more methanol.
Yes, for sure. So does that answer questions in that regard?
Yeah, and also that there's the pectin in the green panca part of the plant, which turns into methanol. Brian, have you heard?
I think that's what the CRM tells us. I think that is true. I mean, it goes along with what I was just talking about. There's less sugar in the penca, so there's more of those fibers, more of the wood, if you will.
But and it also depends on the panca itself or the agave itself. But there's also a lot of flavor that's going to be in there because when you talk about like, an agave, whether espadín or tepestate, our typical pina type of agave, the actual corazon is going to be much more fibrous. It's going to have more of these earth tones compared to the pencas, which are going to have more of the sugar content, much more sweet, roasted sugar elements that we're going to have.
Maybe are you talking about like the actual center part of the piña?
Yes.
As opposed to the so like what people would call the cogollo.
Well, the cogollo is like the very top of the agave, right? Is that what you're talking about? I'm talking about like as the penca. When you looked at the agave cut in half, right? You have the center.
You're talking about an agave that's already had the leaves cut off, or the penca's cut off. So I think that very center part, like what I've heard called like a mesontle or a mesonte, and then outside of that is there's kind of this the beginning of the pencas.
Yes.
And then if the plant were still growing, there's the penca, and like what the CRM recommends is that you shave the piña down until it's white, you know, because that will help lower the methanol content, but it also is stripping
The
a lot
character
of
and the flavor.
some of the flavor.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever I see, you know, pictures of tequila producers from, you know, up until like the early 90s, they had a pretty good chunk of the penca still on the agave when it was being put into an oven. Now you rarely ever see that unless it's going into a diffuser with a bunch of other jive, because they're just trying to get all the sugars out of it they can. They don't even care like what happens, especially when you have a diffuser, which ends up being the most efficient and is able to eliminate as much of the characteristics that bring about the methanol content for the distillate. But to me, that's one of the things that most current producers are lacking.
Yeah.
And I would say even the same thing about mezcal producers that I've seen from Oaxaca, like, you know, 10 plus years ago, they were still leaving a good chunk of the penca on the agave. And now it's like, you know, not so much, but they still leave on more than what tequila producers do, for sure.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, so we went through that. If you want to talk about flavor differences across, you know, how a still is used.
Okay, so just quickly, let's talk. So from one end of the spectrum, you'd have a pot still. That's just one pot on top of another, and you're doing two distillations, and it's pretty inefficient. You're losing a lot of vapor out of the tube where it's condensing. It's not condensing all the alcohol properly. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you'd have like a column still, where it's almost, you know, being distilled like 50 times in one, and you can almost get pure 95% ethanol out of it. And then so in Oaxaca, you have what's called a refrescadera. So it's basically like your regular copper pot still. But in the montera, or the pot that sits on top of the pot where the mash goes, there'll be a couple plates in there, and then that pot will be kept cold with a jacket that has cool water running through it. Do we have a picture of a refrescadera? I don't know if we do.
I did not put one in. I'm sorry.
Okay. So that is just making the still a little more efficient, and that will allow you to do one single distillation. And within the refrescadera type still, there's different, you can kind of play with it and play with the efficiency of it. So you could have cold water running through that jacket the whole time that you're distilling, and that'll make it really efficient, and you'll be getting a higher proof distillate. But you'll also be stripping a lot of those congeners out, so it won't have as much flavor. But you can play with your refrescadera and maybe only fill it once and not have the water cooling it the whole time. So maybe just you start distilling, and once you see that the alcohol that's coming off the still is a little bit lower proof, then you can fill it with cool water, fill that jacket with cool water, maybe once or twice. So there's definitely different ways to play with that refrescadera. And some of the most flavorful mezcal comes from a refrescadera that's being used just a little bit. So they're just refreshing it a tiny bit versus having that cold water running through there constantly. It's really just the efficiency of the still. When you have a really efficient still, you're basically just getting pure ethanol. And when you have an inefficient still, you're getting a lot more of those congeners. The congeners
yep.
are what give you the flavors.
Yep. So then the elements around distillation, how they impact in that context. So higher temperatures can result in lower yield. Ryan was mentioning how he was speaking with a producer who likes to distill at night because he's able to net approximately 3% more liters.
Or three more liters out of maybe 200.
Okay, so yeah, okay.
So not a big difference, but he said there's definitely a difference. That's on the second distillation. And on the first distillation, people often prefer to distill at night. Say you just have one tina, so one fermentation vat, and you decide that it's done fermenting, or it's ready at least to be distilled. If you leave it longer, you'll start to get some off flavors. Maybe you start to get some vinegar. So it's better to just be distilling at night instead of in the heat of the day where your ferment is still fermenting.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to the point of like what the guy was talking about earlier, in the sense that you want to start at the same start your fermentation process at the same temperature as what you're going to end it at, because that will definitely make a huge difference. And then also, the altitude of where you're at is going to affect your distillation process as far as temperature and time, in the same sense that baking is going to, or cooking. And then we have different types of stills, copper/stainless steel pot stills, clay, wood, and within the wood, there's going to be a tree trunk style, as well as slabs of wood that are bound together, and then obviously column still. So Ryan, you want to talk about the
so this is kind of just your traditional copper pot still. So you can see that little flame down there. That's, people, in most cases in traditional mezcal, it's a wood-fired still. Then you're adding your mash or your ferment into this bottom pot. Usually about 3/4 of the way. With some agave, like a jabalí, they'd only be filling it halfway because it foams up so much. So it does depend a little bit what agave you're using, how full you will fill your still. And then the piece that sits on top of that is, in Oaxaca, it's usually called a montera. It's kind of where the first condensation starts. And then you have this, what they call a turbante, going over to this serpentine where that's sitting in a vat of cool water, and that's where most of the condensation is happening. And then you exit and you get your mezcal. So that's the kind of most popular method of distillation here in Oaxaca.
Yeah, and actually you're going to find that throughout most of Mexico, I want to say, if you're going to be talking about like a traditional copper pot distillation, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, regional, in Michoacan and Durango, it's going to be a little bit of a different style, more Filipino influence, which we'll get to in a second, but you'll definitely see this as a common still, and which is also, the tequila, the still that's preferred by tequila distillers have definitely was started off as this and then grew to what it is today. And then, here's going to be those elements shown in real life. And then you're going to put those in. And if you notice, though, the actual pot is going to be encased in concrete, and then fire is going to be used to heat the stills. Some people are going to use wood, and some people are going to use gas to heat them. But the concrete will actually work as a insulator for the stills to keep all the heat within the still without dispersing the heat. And then back behind the gentleman over there is going to be the condensation tank where the serpentine sits in cold water. Then with this is a diagram of what the current style of stills are used within the world of tequila. So on the right, we have the copper pot still. Down on the bottom, you're going to see like this coil that is gray. That's actually the heating coil that's inside the pot that's going to be heated by steam. And that steam underneath, you're going to see is going to be fed in from a pipe underneath into the steam. And then that's going to heat up the pot. You got the evaporation that happens, and then the condensation is going to go over into the yellow part, into the tank, and then collect it out on the other side of that. So the main difference between the two is how the heating of the stills is done. And so I do believe that within the world of tequila, that heat or a direct fire is not allowed for production. I could be wrong, but that's what I've heard from several people. It's not written in the NOM or in the NORMA, but from what I do understand is that you would probably get shut down if you tried to do an actual open flame type of distillation. And obviously the different stills are different types of stills are going to be used. Obviously each size and shape will give different flavor profiles within that context as well. And then, using stainless steel will give you different characteristics. So copper is preferred because it heats faster. It also removes any of the sulfurs that produce these bad flavors that we are looking to remove. Stainless steel just happens to be less expensive and much more efficient. I do believe that in the norma for mezcal, that for a producer to be even artisanal, it has to be done with copper. So stainless steel is no longer allowed within the norma. Would that be correct, Ryan?
I believe so.
Yeah. Can you confirm, Susan? Maybe.
Sorry, sorry, I was muted. I was talking away. Yes, confirming.
Okay, cool.
And then also there was a question. Let's go back to the refrescadera, and it's does it is that still style? Does it impart a particular flavor? Mostly because, as many of us have noticed, mezcals from Ejutla, the area that uses single distillation refrescadoras, have a tendency to taste a little bit more citric or acidic. Does that go back to?
So first of all, I wouldn't say that the mezcal from Ejutla tastes acidic. For me, sometimes mezcal from parts of Michoacán is a lot more acidic than stuff from Ejutla. There is a very specific taste from mezcal from Yogana and a whole section of Ejutla, and I think it has more to do with the water. And for me, I describe it as like a pineapple, almost like a buttery pineapple thing. But then, so I think a refrescadera in general does, especially how they use it in Ejutla. So in Ejutla, mostly they will have it filled with cold water, and it will be flowing constantly. So it's a very efficient distillation. It's stripping, I think, a little more of the flavor, and they're generally proofing it down with water because they're getting a distillate that's around 60, 65%.
Oh, damn.
And they're proofing it down with a significant amount of water. And also, I often will taste a little bit more of a burnt flavor in refrescadera mezcal, or more refrescadera mezcal that's maybe being produced on a little bit bigger scale, because they distill a lot higher temperature. Because it's a little more efficient and they're just doing one pass, they're not as afraid of messing up their first distillation. So they can, if they're not paying enough attention, they just add a lot of leña, a lot of wood. But there's people that use the refrescadera, like I was saying, in different ways. So that's not always the case. There are people in Ejutla that are just filling the refrescadera once, and that they're not proofing it down with water. But I think in general, there is a certain flavor from like the more popular kind of regions of Ejutla, which would be like Amatengo and Yogana and La Compañía, and it has this, I think that has more to do with the water or maybe the yeast, the natural yeast. Yeah,
I totally agree, because I think that when we start talking about like regional aspects, there's going to be a familiar production style for each of these places, but more importantly, the flavor profile that's coming specifically from the water source and the ambient yeast is going to be the key identifiers for those regions.
Yeah. All right, so we're already at over an hour. Should we try to speed up a little here with the pictures?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Susan?
I mean, I think, just so we can get to Q&A. I know one question that came up was a question with David Suro, and that he did a Filipino style sort of distilling on the Ancestral. An open flame.
Distillation was not on an open flame. This is the still that was used by David Suro for the Ancestral at Tequila Cosquin. And so, yeah, it's a Filipino style still. But look, if you notice down at the bottom, you'll see the entry for the steam to be able to heat the still.
Yep.
And I did see a picture of somebody using heat on a still that they actually had sitting outside of the distillery, a small copper pot still. But I don't know, I have not heard of or seen anything from that since, and it's been like a year and a half, 2 years. So. So, so just scroll through. So different types of copper pot stills that are used within the world of tequila. You can tell this is an older pot still that's Siete Legos. And you can see that, this was sitting on something. So back in the day, this was actually being heated by direct flame. And these are their current pot stills that they use within their Tahona facility. The stills that are on the back are used for their first pass. The stills that are closest to us are the ones for their second pass. And you can tell, like, even from back in the day, those first pass stills were sitting on top of what would have been essentially a chamber that would have been heated by fire, which have now been converted into steam heat since then. And then those guys still ferment, do the first distillation with fibers. Then larger copper pot stills. This is from La Tena. And then stainless steel stills on a much bigger, quote, bigger tequila production style at Orandine. And then we get into ancestral style distillation. Ryan, you want to talk about these?
Yeah, so this is still a pot still. So my kind of theory is, most likely distillation came with the Spanish, and they had big copper alembic stills, and people kind of figured out how they worked, and they said, hey, we can make this with clay a lot easier. And this is kind of how the clay pot still started. In most communities in Oaxaca, distilled with clay pots before, almost all of them. Ones that now distill with copper. You ask people to say, "Oh, my grandpa distilled with clay." So it's basically the exact same concept. The only thing that's really different is that this you don't have a serpentine. So the condenser is this bowl on the top that is made out of a metal now. It used to be made out of clay as well, but now it's made out of copper usually. So the vapors rise up, they hit that condenser. There's cool water always flowing through there, through that bowl. And it hits the bottom of it, it condenses, and then it falls, it drips down onto this spoon and exits via a kind of bamboo tube. So with this type of still, there's even more, even less efficient. There's more loss. There's significantly more loss of ethanol when you're distilling. And that's part of the reason that clay pot distilled mezcal is more expensive. And this is kind of the Filipino system. So people say that this style of distillation most likely comes from Asia, and that it came to the Pacific coast of Mexico and kind of worked its way down past Colima, down to throughout other parts of Mexico. That's one theory.
Yeah, as I was pulling all these things together, I stumbled across a family in India who uses who was doing a clay pot distillation similar to this with a rice wine. It was just a single distillate they were doing, but really interesting to see. And like those guys were actually adding the water by hand, emptying it by hand, and then adding it by hand.
Which is what they are doing in San Luis Potosí with internal distillation.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting. But within that context, you see how, with these stills here, you see how the water is, there's a trough where the water is poured into the top of the bell, and then there's an exit for the hot water to leave. So it's just consistently flowing within that. Ryan, are you familiar with what is being done with that water?
It's usually just being recirculated, maybe into either back into the well or back into or a river sometimes, but usually they're recirculating it. It's just being cooled down somewhere else.
Yeah. And within that context, putting it back into the river, there's, there's nothing unsanitary about that, because of the fact that it is just water.
Yeah, it's just
not
water.
touching anything other than the natural elements of life, right? And then you can see how large those clay pots can be. So I believe that these are 50-liter pot stills. It's going to heat by wood, and then you can see underneath. So those pots are actually sitting on top of something. Then they're going to light the fire underneath that. And then we get into Raicilla country, using tree trunks. This is going to be similar to what's used in Puebla. What other regions are using tree trunks for distillation, Brian?
Maybe Jalisco, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think in Michoacan it's more of a wine barrel, and Durango as well.
Yeah, I mean, outside of Jalisco and Puebla, is anybody else using tree trunk style?
I'm not sure. Not that I know of right off the bat. Maybe actually, I saw a picture of one in Morelos.
Okay. Cool. So this is kind of cool. I had visited this not Vinata. I forget what the colloquial term for distillery is in Jalisco off the top. I'm sure Brian's be like, dude, it is. anyway, so I was really surprised when Rossi sent me this picture that how small the actual pot is, and that pot is going to taberna. Thank you, Rossi. So it's called a taberna, which is going to be the colloquial term within the region of Ricea. I also think somewhere else, I can't remember. But that has to be maybe a 20, 25 liter pot still, which is super small. I'm really surprised. And that definitely looks like a lot of weight that's standing on top of that.
All right, I think we got to flip forward a little bit faster now.
Yeah. So and then we get into Michoacan style. So still wood, but using slabs of wood. And Rossi says Zacatecas as well. And then these are going to be heated more like a pizza style oven, where they're able to control the temperature a little bit more. And this is going to be underneath the still. So it's more of a cone shape for where the condensation happens. That on top, much larger, obviously, and then that influenced the style of what Tequila Cosquin is using for the Siembra Valles Ancestral distillation. And then we get into column stills, which is very large, very efficient. However, you can still make some tasty stuff out of it as long as you don't strip the hell out of it. And that's basically the slideshow.
Okay, well, I think one thing we didn't cover the San Luis Potosí. I think we skipped over that slide.
Yeah, you didn't send that to me, yo.
You did. It's in your. I saw you. It's in your presentation.
I think it's in there.
I think it was before maybe the clay pot or.
No. Oh, all I had was this. That's the only thing I had.
Yeah. Let me just quickly talk about this.
Okay.
So this is the internal collection still. It's used in San Luis Potosí, really just in one small region. So think of a regular clay pot still, like the pot still diagram that we showed you. But as you can see, there's no tube exiting. So they add the ferment or the mash in, and then they seal it up. On the top, there is a metal bowl that has cool water going through it, which they are adding in by hand. And the vapors condense on that, and they fall into this other recipient that's suspended within that pot. And that has these counterweights on it that are chunks of agave penca. And they can tell how full it is by when it starts to get more full of liquid, it has more weight, and those counterweights start to move up. So that's how they know when it is ready. And then they have to take off that top pot, the condenser pot, to access the distillate. So it's this crazy and labor-intensive and very primitive way of distilling. But it actually makes some of the most flavorful mezcal that you will ever try in your life.
And is this region, I mean, there's only a few products that are actually being exported right now. Is anything coming from this region? Any brands that you're familiar with?
Alma
Mezcalera, it's the Campanilla Mezcal Campanilla that comes in. And I mean, there's Mezcales de Leyenda and Derumbes are coming from San Luis Potosí, but those productions, they do not use this type of still. Those are the regular copper stills. But no, this is, I mean, the production runs on this mezcal are incredibly small, but it is Alma Mezcalera.
If you can look on Facebook for Mezcal de Campanilla, it's the Navarro family. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, if you can get it in Mexico.
It doesn't help most of us who are on this.
No, I know, and certainly not right now.
But I also want to say that this is very similar to the style of distillation that has been that is being debated as to whether or not actually existed, that was found in Colima, that as to whether or not that was happening before or after the Spanish conquest.
I've heard that there's another, that the Huichol still, so maybe there's a part of maybe Jalisco or the border with Jalisco and like Nayarit where there's another internal captation still.
Okay.
I've never tried that mezcal.
Oh, that one. Okay, I didn't know if that was an internal. Okay, so that's part of the La Venenosa line, I believe.
And I mean, is there a specific flavor profile that, or tasting notes that come with the internal capture?
I mean, I've only tried it from this one family, and there really is only maybe one. There's one Palenque really operating, and then I've heard that there's maybe a couple more in the area, but I've only tried it from this one family, so I wouldn't have anything to compare it to. And I mean, I can tell you that it's very, very flavorful. I think that something about the system, it's capturing more of those congeners. It's there's not a lot escaping from that still. Obviously, something has to escape because it's heating up.
Right.
But
I mean,
Clay, right?
it's an incredibly efficient production. And the reuse of the water is pretty incredible. I mean, everything about it is just like there's very little waste. And I think that has to do, of course, with just the historical component of that, of not having a lot to waste. In terms of the flavor profile of it, I mean, it's hard to say, mostly because they're using Salmiana. And I think that, you know, in my opinion, there's Salmiana imparts a really intensely deep and rich flavor. And that's the first thing that always hits me when I'm tasting mezcal, excuse me, from Compañía, and then also in general from San Luis Potosí. It is just a really, there's just so much depth and flavor within the Salmiana, sorry.
someone asked, are they cutting? They traditionally did not make any cuts, but I've heard, I went out there actually, and they were experimenting with making cuts because they're trying to get their mezcal to not to pass analysis, you know, to not have the higher levels of methanol, even though I think it comes out around 800, so it's still between like the schnapps and the 300 that the CRM allows, but they've been playing with. So when I was there when they were trying to make a cut, and they literally have to pop the top off of it and scoop out a couple scoops of the mezcal, and then shut it back in. That was their way of making the cut.
Well, that's the first time that I've seen that, been aware of that. Definitely going to be looking for that soon, for sure.
Yep.
Cool. So that's in the slideshow. I don't think I can. Oh, hey, there we go. Stop share. Boom. Okay. So give the floor back to Susan.
Yeah, well, I mean, now's the time to start diving into any other questions that people might have for us here that we didn't get to during the presentation. I know the number one question is there going to be a recording of this? Yes. And I'm hoping to get it emailed out to everybody and posted on the website by the end of the week. So we'll be following up with that. We're going to have recordings of all of the different conversations in Agave that are happening. And for all of you that registered for this one, you are now on the list, and you will be getting links each week. Hopefully it will be the same link and getting that set. for the remainder of the presentations in April. And we will have 2 a week, 1 on Mondays and then 1 on Wednesdays. So get that out to you. And yes. So some of the questions that are coming up: do any mezcaleros intentionally allow or even encourage temperature to vary during the fermentation?
No, you want to, be consistent with that. Fermentation is the most volatile aspect of production.
Yeah, I think it just naturally, at least in Oaxaca and most places, most people's fermentation tanks are outside. Some people do have them inside in concrete rooms. So they're just naturally, the temperature is varying a lot, and that's making for kind of a funky fermentation. And I think that also has a lot to do with why mezcal is so flavorful, because you end up with a lot of these other chemicals that are produced from yeast that's not necessarily super happy.
But that yeast is being consistent throughout. So it's kind of like, it finds its lifestyle cycle, just kind of moving in and out throughout.
Yeah.
But I think if you get into like the coastal region of Jalisco or the Raicilla, some of those guys are doing fermentation of like 2 to 4 weeks. Yeah. And I don't know if that's necessarily because of the weather or if that's just what they are, the flavors that they're looking for, especially when you get up into the Sierra regions where it can be really hot during the day and super chilly at night. Well, cold for me, and for the region, when you go from like 90 degrees down to 45 degrees in the same day is pretty drastic for sure. And those guys.
So a lot of it has to do also with elevation and weather. If it's elevation or if it's colder out, usually you're going to have a longer fermentation. And also just tradition. I think in Miahuatlan in Oaxaca, the fermentations usually go a little longer. When I've tasted the ferments, the mashes, they're a little more acidic. I can often taste that there's already like vinegar notes, like acetic acid being created. Whereas maybe in like Santa Catarina, Minas, they're stopping the fermentation quite a bit sooner, where it's still pretty sweet, and you're not getting as much of those kind of weird off flavors.
I know earlier there was a question about what the historical kind of background was for the unique Ejutla style single distillation, and that's still and where that might have come from, or why it's just remained such an Ejutla specific use. Like you'll see some used sometimes, but primarily it is Ejutla. Any idea, Ryan, on?
I read something the other day on on Cornelio, what's his name? Cornelio Perez, his website, and he mentioned the person that invented that still in Ejutla. So a mezcal producer in Ejutla invented that refrescadera style still.
Interesting. Do you know what year?
I don't remember what the year was, but I could find that out.
And is it used much in Miahuatlan as well, or?
Yeah, so there was a period where a lot of people in Miahuatlan, like all of San Luis Amatlan and other parts of Miahuatlan, used the refrescadera. And then I think kind of with the start of the CRM is when they started switching to the double distillation, but there are still people in San Luis Amatlan that use refrescadera, and in Mengoli, and then like, the Cañada, which is kind of right between Ejutla and Miahuatlan. So there's still people definitely in Miahuatlan using a refrescadera.
And for those that are not familiar with, the layout of Oaxaca, like from Ihutla down to Miahuatlán, that's like a corridor, and where you're in, like you can see the similarities of influences in production. So there's not, and they're on the west side of the valley versus opposed to the east side. Like I don't think there's anybody on the east side of the valley who uses a refrescadera, nor in the valley itself. I mean, I could be wrong, but I have, not that I've ever seen or even heard of. Would you say that's correct?
Well, I have a map, actually. You could look on the Maestros del Mezcal website.
It is a great map, for sure.
Yeah, and one of my regions is called the Zona Refrescadera. And it is kind of, I guess it would be the west side of the freeway that goes from Oaxaca to Miahuatlán. And then parts of the east side when you get closer to Miahuatlán, so like around Mengolí de Morelos and San Luis Amatlán, there's some people that are using refrescadera.
But as far as like the actual, Central Valley itself, so I see.
Well, really, I mean, Miahuatlán technically is still part of the Central Valley, even though it's called Sierra Sur. It's still the
but
valley.
technically, wouldn't it be on the eastern side of?
I mean, it kind of runs north to south. So.
Yeah. Well, the valley does, as far as
Okay. Not to cut you off, but moving on. Question about if there's a typical harvest season for agave. And does it vary from agave varieties? Is it different for different elevations?
So generally, at least here in Oaxaca, the best time to harvest agave is at the end of the dry season, where the agave doesn't have very much water, so the sugars are more concentrated. It's kind of the same idea with grapes. If anyone's familiar with grapes, like the end of summer, the grapes have the most sugar, they're ripe, and if it rains, it can really mess up your grape harvest because you're diluting the sugars in the grapes. It's the same deal with agave. If you harvest an agave during the rainy season, it'll be waterlogged and you'll just have less sugar content. And it also works out kind of beautifully with the mezcal producers because most people are starting to plant corn and beans and whatever right before or at the start of the rainy season. So that's when they stop making mezcal, and they're going to be working all summer. Or the rainy season here in Oaxaca is about from like May, June until like September-ish. So they'll be farming those months and won't have time to make mezcal. But it also it's not a good time to make mezcal necessarily.
Yep.
And then the question of how does roasting affect the water content?
You want to get that one, Khrys?
I don't think that the roasting has anything to do with water content. I mean, like, you have to pay attention in the context of in your roast, how much water content is in the agave, right? So you want to stick, the agave that have the highest water content closest to the rocks. So on top of the rocks, you're going to have the fibra, which is the spent fibers from your production, that is going to be like your insulator between the agave and the hot rocks. And if you put really super dry agave on top of that, you're going to have a much more scorched agave that will lead into, that was awesome, those burnt flavor profiles, which I had been talking about, but I don't think that, the roast is.
But more like, right. So I think the question is, if you have a piña that has a high water content, then within the roasting process, it pulls the water out of the piña. I mean, what is that? It's, I guess, in the cooking process, right? That's what
Yeah,
into the vapors and the caramelization.
yeah, but you end up with you're still end up with an agave that has less sugar, right?
What's going on here?
Ooh, Ryan's got his
You're-
green screen on.
Yeah, he's disappearing into the background.
Yep.
Uh,
All right. Any other questions here for the group? I think I got through the other questions that were asked. I mean, as you can see, this was much longer than a half-hour presentation followed by Q&A. Once we got going on, prepping for this and talking about distillation, it was the realization that there's no way you can get through it in a short period of time and do it any justice.
And this just scratches the surface.
Yeah. There is so much information there. I really trying to understand distillation has been a focus for me. I have more time now to read. I'm reading the book Proof. And then also, oh God, I'm blanking on the other book, Distillation. Khrys, you were the one that recommended it to me, just to try and get my understanding up around it. And then, next week, we're going to have Francisco Terrazas on from Mezcal Vago. And one of the things he's really going to focus on is they work with a few different mezcaleros and, talking about just the difference and the role, the terroir, basically, of the mezcalero himself or herself in the making of mezcal, and just that guiding hand and the differences in flavor that you get out beyond it's a different location or perhaps using different agave in it, but to dive into the thought process that a mezcalero gets into, how he or she is making mezcal. So that is on for next week.
And within that, like, Francisco has done an amazing blog that's over at, I forget, the Vago's website. That's always super awesome. He did a great one on fermentation and acids. And Rion also has some great education that's on his podcast as well. Definitely, link up with those guys to see what they have going on. Absolutely amazing. And like every time I talk to, both these guys or read whatever they've written or listen to what they've said, I've been able to learn a lot. So absolutely awesome.
Okay, we've got one more question that came in, and that is, do most mezcaleros do things like punch downs like during fermentation as they do in wine? I mean, Rion, you have the experience of doing both, winemaking and mezcal making.
Yeah, I've never seen anyone do a punch down. I've thought about it before. But I think they're like in some towns, they'll kind of mix it up. Maybe the first few days or maybe the first day when it's fermenting, while there's still a little more sugar content. And then they'll kind of try to form this cap over it that they won't mess with. And I think that's kind of trying to kind of protect the fermentation and kind of keep it more stable temperature, not let too much oxygen in. But that's definitely not the case in all towns. So it's something that varies a lot.
Yep.
Cool. All right. In case anybody didn't see that in the chat, the name of Francisco's blog is masmezcal.com.
Yeah.
To check that out.
And next week, or is he tomorrow?
He is next week, on Monday. On Wednesday, we are going to be talking with Jose Maria Donde of Panorama Mezcal as part of our kind of Behind the Bar series, where we will be talking to different bartenders around the country. And so that is Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Jose Maria, or Chema, as many of us know him as, has been really instrumental in the New York market of building a mezcal following there. Through his events, Bartender Legion, and other things, and has recently moved to Miami. And so he's really going to look at the two different mezcal kind of markets between Miami and New York. So it'll be interesting. And I'm sure we'll get some great stories out of him from bartending experiences. So that is this coming Wednesday. And otherwise, I'm going to say, number one, thank you, Khrys and Rion, for putting so much time and detail into this talk. Distillation is a lot. And thank you all for signing up for this. Looking forward to the continued conversations we're going to have, and just really like being able to take advantage of doing stuff online. And, you know, while I was behind the scenes saying, hurry up, you guys, we got to get through this material, to have a little bit more time than our events, Mexico in a Bottle. So this is great to really be able to dive into it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right.
Check us out
Thank
on
you, guys.
maestrosdelmezcal.com, you know. Follow the Instagram, Maestros del Mezcal.
Maestros del Mezcal for sure. All right. Thank you guys, and see you all later.
Thank
Bye.
you. Have a good night, guys. Late.
Bye.
Salute.